London, December 1943. The air raid sirens had fallen silent hours ago, but Thomas Garrett couldn't sleep. The 32-year-old engineer sat at his kitchen table in his modest Bethnal Green flat, a piece of ordinary cotton string wrapped around his fingers, twisting it methodically in the dim light of a single candle. Outside, the winter fog pressed thick and oppressive against the blackout curtains, turning the December night into an impenetrable wall of grey that seemed to swallow all sound and light. Somewhere in the distance, a night watchman's whistle pierced the darkness, a lonely sound that reminded Thomas of how isolated he felt in this moment, surrounded by millions yet utterly alone with his thoughts and the problem that refused to let him rest. The kitchen was bitterly cold. Coal was strictly rationed, and Thomas had learned to live with the chill that permeated every corner of his flat during these brutal winter months. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he worked, his fingers growing increasingly stiff and clumsy as he manipulated the string, testing its tension, watching with intense focus how it responded to different configurations and pressures. On the scarred wooden table beside him sat a cold cup of tea, forgotten hours ago, its surface now covered with a thin film, and a half-eaten sandwich from dinner, the bread already going stale and hard in the frigid air. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the peeling wallpaper, shadows that seemed to mock his efforts, making the simple piece of string in his hands appear alternately promising and absurd. Thomas had been working at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough for the past 18 months, designing critical components for the Lancaster bombers that flew dangerous missions over occupied Europe every single night, carrying their deadly cargo to German cities and military installations. The work was important, vital even, but tonight his mind wasn't focused on turbines or fuel systems or any of the complex mechanical problems he solved during his regular work hours. Tonight, his entire consciousness was consumed by something far simpler, and perhaps, he dared to hope, far more important than anything he'd accomplished in his professional career thus far. He twisted the string again, creating a complex pattern between his fingers, watching with scientific precision how it created and distributed tension, how such a basic principle, one that had existed since humans first discovered cordage, could potentially solve a problem that had been plaguing the aircraft engineers for weeks, costing precious lives with each failure. The parachute deployment mechanism on the Lancaster bombers kept jamming at high altitudes, where temperatures plummeted far below freezing, and the air grew thin enough to make breathing difficult even with oxygen equipment. Men were dying because of these failures, brave pilots and crew members who'd survived enemy fire and mechanical failures, only to plummet to their deaths when their parachutes failed to deploy properly during emergency ejections. And here, in his freezing cold kitchen, with nothing but a piece of ordinary cotton string and an idea that had come to him in a moment of desperate inspiration, Thomas thought he might have finally found the answer that had eluded teams of experienced engineers for months. The solution wasn't in complex machinery or expensive new materials. It was in understanding something fundamental about tension and distribution, about redundancy and organic systems. It was in recognizing that sometimes the simplest approaches, the ones that nature had perfected over millions of years of evolution, were superior to the most sophisticated mechanical designs that human ingenuity could devise. If you're enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us bring you more incredible true stories from history, stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things during humanity's darkest hours. The next morning arrived grey and cold, frost covering the windows in intricate patterns that sparkled briefly in the weak December sunlight before melting into rivulets of water. Thomas took the early train to Farnborough, his precious briefcase clutched tightly against his chest, protecting it from the crush of other passengers who packed the carriage beyond its intended capacity. The train car was filled to bursting with factory workers heading to the munitions plants, soldiers on leave returning to their units, their uniforms worn and their faces showing the strain of years of warfare, and women in the crisp uniforms of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, many of them barely out of their teenage years, yet carrying responsibilities that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Everyone looked exhausted, worn down by years of rationing and bombing and loss. The optimism that had characterized the early days of the war, the belief that it would all be over quickly, had long since faded into a grim, determined resignation to see it through to whatever end awaited them. Conversations were muted, people saving their energy for the long workday ahead. A young mother sat across from Thomas, her two small children sleeping against her shoulders, their faces thin from inadequate nutrition despite everyone's best efforts. The woman caught Thomas staring and gave him a tired smile that spoke of sleepless nights in bomb shelters and mornings spent queuing for rationed goods. Thomas clutched his briefcase even tighter, feeling the weight of his notebook inside, the pages filled with calculations and sketches he'd labored over through the long night, working by candlelight because the electricity had been cut again, another consequence of the strained infrastructure that struggled to keep pace with wartime demands. The string trick, as he'd started calling it in his mind, trying to make light of something that felt almost too important to bear, was elegantly simple in its concept. By using a specific configuration of tension strings within the parachute pack, arranged in a pattern that mimicked the way tendons distributed force in the human body, the deployment mechanism would be dramatically more reliable, less prone to the tangling and jamming that occurred when pilots ejected at high speeds in sub-zero temperatures where metal became brittle and fabric stiff as board. At Farnborough, the research facility sprawled across seemingly endless acres of secured land, a vast maze of hangars, workshops, testing grounds, and austere administrative buildings, all surrounded by multiple layers of barbed wire fencing and patrolled constantly by armed guards who took their duties with deadly seriousness. Thomas showed his identification card to the soldier at the main gate, a young man with a thick Scottish accent and a face that still carried traces of acne, who barely glanced at the document before waving him through with a cursory nod, perhaps recognizing Thomas from his daily arrivals, or perhaps simply too cold to care about thorough scrutiny on this bitter morning. The engineering department was already a hive of frantic activity when Thomas arrived, despite the early hour. War didn't respect normal working hours, and critical projects ran around the clock, staffed by dedicated people who understood that every hour of delay might mean more casualties in the field. His colleague, Peter Blackwood, a balding man in his mid-40s who'd worked in aircraft design since well before the war, back in the days when aviation was still considered somewhat exotic and dangerous, looked up from his drafting table where he was making meticulous adjustments to a fuel system schematic. "You look absolutely terrible, Tommy," Peter said with characteristic bluntness, his reading glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose. "Rough night? Please tell me you at least tried to get some sleep." Thomas set down his briefcase carefully, as if it contained something fragile and precious, which in a way it did. "Actually, I think I've solved the parachute problem. The jamming issue that's been killing our pilots." Peter's bushy eyebrows rose dramatically, nearly disappearing into his receding hairline. His expression shifted from routine morning greeting to intense interest in an instant. "The jamming issue. Thomas, we've had 12 of our best engineers working on that problem for 3 solid months. Some of the most experienced minds in British aviation have been bashing their heads against it. What makes you think you've found something they missed?" "I know how it sounds, believe me," Thomas said, pulling out his notebook and opening it to reveal pages covered in detailed diagrams, mathematical calculations, and careful sketches. "But I think I've found something genuinely new. It's based on tension distribution principles, but approached from a completely different angle than what the team has been pursuing. We've been thinking of the deployment mechanism as a purely mechanical system, trying to engineer more reliable springs and catches and releases. But what if we approach it more like a biological system instead? Like how tendons and ligaments work in the human body to distribute force and provide redundancy. Peter leaned in closer, his engineer's mind immediately grasping the implications, even as his expression remained skeptical. He studied the drawings with the intensity of a man who'd spent decades learning to spot both brilliance and foolishness in technical designs. "This is quite clever, actually," he admitted after several long minutes of examination. "You're using multiple strings to create redundant tension points throughout the deployment mechanism. If one fails, the others automatically compensate without requiring any active intervention or complex mechanical backup systems." "Exactly right," Thomas said, feeling a surge of relief that Peter understood immediately what he was trying to achieve. "The beauty of it is the simplicity. No additional moving parts that can freeze or malfunction at altitude. No springs that can lose their temper in extreme cold. Just properly configured strings creating a web of mutually supporting tension points. It's biomimicry, really, though I didn't think of it in those terms until after I'd worked out the basic principle." "Have you actually tested this theory? Built even a basic prototype?" "Only theoretical calculations so far, but the mathematics are sound, Peter. I've checked them a dozen times through the night. I need access to the workshop and materials to build a working model, but I'm confident this will work. It has to work." Peter glanced around the busy office, then lowered his voice to barely above a whisper, mindful of the various security protocols that govern their work. "Show this to Henderson immediately. Don't wait. Don't second-guess yourself. If this actually works, if it does what you think it can do, this could save dozens of lives, maybe hundreds before the war ends. The Major needs to see this today." Major William Henderson was the senior commanding officer overseeing their entire division, responsible for coordinating multiple critical research projects simultaneously. A highly decorated RAF pilot who'd been reluctantly grounded after losing his left leg below the knee in a spectacular crash over France 2 years earlier, Henderson had developed a well-earned reputation throughout Farnborough for being tough but scrupulously fair, demanding but reasonable, and most importantly for the engineers who worked under his command, for actually listening to their ideas regardless of their rank or seniority. He evaluated proposals on their merits rather than on the credentials of whoever presented them, a rare quality in the rigid military hierarchy that governed wartime research. Thomas found him in his cramped office, a space that seemed far too small for a man of Henderson's importance, reviewing thick stacks of mission reports and casualty analyses. The Major's scarred wooden desk was completely buried under papers, stark black and white photographs of damaged and destroyed aircraft, lists of casualties that grew longer each week, and technical reports from various departments, all clamoring for resources and attention. Henderson looked up when Thomas knocked hesitantly on the doorframe, his sharp blue eyes immediately assessing the younger man with the practiced gaze of someone who'd learned to read people quickly and accurately. "Garrett, isn't it?" Henderson said, his voice carrying the clipped precision of his upper-class education. "What can I do for you this morning?" "Sir, I'd like to present a potential solution to the parachute deployment failures we've been experiencing in the Lancaster fleet," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the nervousness that made his hands want to shake. Henderson gestured to one of the chairs facing his desk, moving aside a stack of requisition forms to make room. "I'm listening. You have my complete attention." For the next 25 minutes, Thomas explained his concept in exhaustive detail, walking Henderson through the theoretical framework, the mathematical calculations that supported it, and the practical advantages over current designs. Henderson didn't interrupt once, his sharp blue eyes moving methodically between Thomas's face, watching for any signs of uncertainty or exaggeration, and the detailed diagrams in the notebook following the logic of the design with evident understanding. When Thomas finally finished his presentation, his throat dry from talking, the Major leaned back in his chair and was silent for a long moment, clearly thinking through the implications. "You came up with this entire concept last night, at home, working alone?" "Yes, sir. I couldn't stop thinking about the problem after I left yesterday. The solution came to me while I was doing something completely mundane, just sitting at my kitchen table, playing with a piece of string to keep my hands busy. Sometimes the mind makes unexpected connections when you're not consciously forcing it." Henderson smiled slightly, the first time Thomas had ever seen any hint of humor on the Major's usually stern face. Some of the best innovations in aviation history have come from exactly that kind of simple observation, Lieutenant Commander Garrett. During the last war, I knew a pilot who revolutionized gun synchronization because he watched his wife working at a sewing machine. Never underestimate the value of seeing ordinary things with fresh eyes. Now, how quickly can you build a functional prototype for testing? If I can have unrestricted access to the workshop and whatever materials I need, I could have something ready for preliminary testing within a week, sir. Maybe less if everything goes smoothly. "You have 48 hours, Garrett," Henderson said flatly, but his tone wasn't harsh, just matter of fact. "We're losing pilots at an unacceptable rate, and every day of delay means more families receiving telegrams they'll never recover from. If this works even half as well as your calculations suggest, I want it in full production within a month. Get whatever help you need, requisition any materials necessary, and work around the clock if you have to. This is now your only assignment until further notice. Understood?" "Yes, sir. Completely understood. Thank you, sir." Thomas spent the next 48 hours living in the workshop, a cavernous space that smelled perpetually of machine oil, hot metal, rubber, sawdust, and the acrid smoke from countless cigarettes. He barely slept, catching occasional 15-minute naps on a cot someone had thoughtfully set up in the corner, surviving on endless cups of strong tea and sandwiches that the kind women who staffed the canteen brought him at regular intervals, often staying beyond their shifts to make sure the engineers had what they needed. Peter helped whenever his other duties allowed, bringing his decades of practical experience to solve the inevitable problems that arose during fabrication. They were also assisted by Margaret Chen, a brilliantly talented mathematician who'd been recruited directly from Cambridge, where she'd been working on her doctorate before the war interrupted everyone's plans, and David Foster, a former motorcycle mechanic from Manchester, who possessed the seemingly magical ability to build anything from scratch if you could describe what you needed. They worked through incredibly complex calculations, testing different types of cordage to find materials with exactly the right properties, experimenting exhaustively with various tensile strengths and deployment speeds, failing repeatedly and learning from each failure. The workshop became their entire world, a bubble of focused intensity where nothing existed except the problem and their determination to solve it. Outside, the December rain fell steadily, relentlessly, turning the facility grounds into a quagmire of sticky mud that clung to boots and made every journey between buildings an exhausting slog. On the afternoon of the second day, working on perhaps their fourth hour of sleep total between them, they were finally ready for the crucial first test. They'd constructed a scale model of a parachute pack incorporating Thomas's string mechanism, a thing of surprising beauty in its elegant simplicity, and the moment of truth had arrived. Major Henderson came down to the workshop to observe personally, bringing with him several other officers whose ribbons and insignia indicated significant rank, and a small crowd of engineers from other departments who'd heard rumors about what was being attempted. The test protocol, involved dropping the model from a crane at carefully calibrated speeds, simulating as closely as possible the actual conditions a pilot would experience during emergency ejection at various altitudes and aircraft velocities. The first drop was slow and controlled, barely faster than letting it fall naturally. The parachute deployed perfectly, the canopy spreading smoothly and completely. A murmur of approval ran through the watching crowd, but everyone knew the real tests were yet to come. The second drop was significantly faster, approaching actual ejection speeds. Again, perfect deployment. The strings engaged exactly as Thomas had calculated, distributing the opening shock evenly and preventing any hint of tangling or malfunction. The third test simulated high-altitude, high-speed conditions, the absolutely most challenging scenario that had been causing the deadly failures in actual combat situations. The crushing forces involved, combined with temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in seconds, created an environment where even minor imperfections in design became catastrophic failures. Thomas held his breath, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears as the model dropped like a stone, reaching terminal velocity before the simulated ejection occurred. The parachute pack opened precisely on cue. The strings engaged with perfect synchronization, working together exactly as the biological systems Thomas had studied, and the canopy deployed smoothly, completely, without even the slightest hint of a tangle or jam, or any of the problems that had been killing pilots for months. The workshop erupted in spontaneous applause, grown men cheering and slapping each other on the back like children at a birthday party. Peter grabbed Thomas in an enthusiastic bear hug that nearly crushed his ribs. Margaret Chen actually jumped up and down with uncharacteristic loss of composure, and David Foster let out a whoop of triumph that echoed off the high ceiling. Major Henderson approached Thomas with measured steps, his face showing more emotion than Thomas had imagined the stern officer capable of expressing, and extended his hand in formal congratulation. "Excellent work, Garrett. Truly outstanding. We'll begin full-scale testing with actual aircraft immediately, but based on what I just witnessed, I'm authorizing production preparations to begin. This could be operational within weeks." Over the following days, word of the string trick spread rapidly through Farnborough and beyond, traveling through the interconnected network of research facilities and military installations that formed the hidden backbone of Britain's war effort. Other engineers wanted to examine Thomas's design firsthand to understand the underlying principle that had eluded so many intelligent people for so long. He found himself giving impromptu presentations to groups of increasingly senior officers and scientists, explaining the biomechanical inspiration, walking through the tension calculations, demonstrating the redundancy built into the system that made it so remarkably reliable. On the fifth day after his initial presentation to Major Henderson, Thomas was summoned to an unexpected meeting. He arrived to find Henderson waiting with two men Thomas had never seen before. They wore expensive but unremarkable civilian clothes, the kind designed to avoid drawing attention, but they carried themselves with an unmistakable military bearing that no amount of civilian camouflage could completely hide. One was tall and thin, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent considerable time in harsh climates. The other was shorter and more powerfully built, with intense dark eyes that seemed to catalogue and assess everything they saw, and he spoke with a faint accent that Thomas couldn't immediately place. "Garrett, these gentlemen are from the Special Operations Executive," Henderson said carefully, his tone suggesting this was a conversation of serious importance. "They have some questions about your work and a proposition they'd like to discuss with you. I'll leave you to talk privately, but know that you have my complete support, whatever you decide." The tall man spoke first, after Henderson departed, his voice cultured and precise. "Mr. Garrett, your innovation is quite remarkable. We've reviewed the technical documentation, and several of our analysts believe that the fundamental principle behind your string trick could potentially have significant applications far beyond parachute deployment mechanisms. Thomas felt a cold knot form in his stomach, anxiety tightening his chest. The SOE was responsible for espionage, sabotage, covert operations, and other activities in occupied Europe that the government preferred not to discuss openly. What kind of applications exactly? That's classified at the moment, I'm afraid, the man said with apparent regret that might or might not have been genuine. But we'd like to discuss the possibility of you consulting on a special project. It would require you to sign extensive additional security documentation and possibly undertake travel abroad, dangerous travel to very dangerous places. Travel where specifically? Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The shorter man spoke for the first time, his accent now clearly identifiable as Eastern European, possibly Czech. That would be determined based on specific operational needs as they develop. But I can tell you that your particular expertise could prove invaluable to certain resistance operations currently ongoing in occupied territories. You would be helping brave people fight against tyranny in ways that few others could. Thomas looked between the two men, trying to read their faces for any hint of what they were really asking him to do. I'm not a soldier. I'm not trained for combat or espionage. I'm just an engineer who happened to have one good idea. The best operatives are rarely professional soldiers, Mr. Garrett, the tall man said softly. They're ordinary people with specialized knowledge who possess the courage to use that knowledge when and where it matters most. Soldiers stand out in occupied territory. Engineers consulting on technical matters are far less remarkable, far easier to explain if questions are asked. That evening, Thomas walked through the darkened streets of Farnborough, his mind churning as he tried to process what had been offered to him and what it might mean. The blackout made navigation difficult, forcing him to feel his way along familiar routes made strange and treacherous by the absence of light. The idea that his simple string trick could be adapted for use in espionage operations seemed simultaneously absurd and terrifying. But the war had an inexorable way of taking ordinary things, mundane objects and simple ideas, and transforming them into tools that could save lives or take them, depending on whose hands held them and what purposes they served. He found himself at the King's Arms, a pub near the train station where many of the facility workers gathered after their shifts to decompress and try to maintain some semblance of normal life. The interior was dim and smoky, crowded with people seeking temporary escape from the grinding stress of wartime work. Peter Blackwood was there as he often was, nursing a pint of bitter at the bar, staring into the amber liquid as if it might contain answers to questions he hadn't yet figured out how to ask. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Peter observed as Thomas sat heavily on the stool beside him, "or received some very bad news. Or possibly both." "Something like that," Thomas admitted, signaling the bartender for whiskey, which was unusual for him and made Peter's eyebrows rise. "Can I ask you something, completely off the record, just between us as friends?" Peter nodded seriously, recognizing that whatever was coming was important. "Of course. Always. If you were asked to do something for the war effort, something potentially very dangerous, would you do it, even if it meant leaving everything familiar behind, possibly not coming back?" Peter was quiet for a long moment, taking a slow sip of his beer before responding. "My son Timothy is flying missions over Germany right now as we sit here. He's 20 years old, barely old enough to vote, and every night he climbs into a bomber and flies into hell itself. If there was anything I could do, anything at all, to bring him home safely or to bring any of our boys home alive, I'd do it without a moment's hesitation." "Why are you asking me this, Tommy?" Thomas took a sip of his whiskey, feeling it burn down his throat. "I might be going away for a while. If I do, I need you to promise me something. Make sure the parachute project continues. Don't let bureaucracy or budget constraints or interdepartmental politics shelve it. Too many men have died already because we didn't solve this sooner." Of course I'll make sure it continues, but Tommy, what's really going on? Where are they sending you? I can't say. I'm genuinely not even completely sure myself yet. But I wanted you to know, just in case. And the next morning, Thomas signed the Official Secrets Act documents that the SOE representatives presented, page after page of dense legal language about treason, imprisonment, capital punishment for disclosure of classified information, and consequences so severe they made his hands tremble as he added his signature to the final page. The weight of what he was committing to felt almost physical, pressing down on his shoulders. "What happens now?" he asked when the paperwork was finally complete. The tall man, who'd finally introduced himself as Colonel Davies, though Thomas suspected that wasn't his real name, smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Now we begin preparing you for field work. You'll receive training in covert communication techniques, basic self-defense, escape and evasion protocols, survival skills, and other specialized knowledge you'll need. Then if you're deemed psychologically and physically suitable for the work, you'll be deployed to where you're most needed." Deployed where exactly? Occupied France. There's a resistance cell operating near Lyon that desperately needs technical assistance. They're conducting sabotage operations against German rail lines, bridges and supply depots, but they lack the specialized engineering knowledge to maximize their effectiveness while minimizing their risk. Your understanding of tension systems, mechanical advantage, and simple but elegant solutions to complex problems could help them develop far more effective methods that would save civilian lives while still achieving their objectives. Thomas felt his mouth go completely dry, his heart beginning to race. France. Occupied France, crawling with Wehrmacht soldiers, Gestapo agents, French collaborators, and all the apparatus of Nazi oppression. I'm not a soldier. I'm not trained for combat or living behind enemy lines. I'm an engineer who works at a desk, which is precisely what makes you valuable, Mr. Garrett, Davies said patiently. The best operatives, the ones who survive and accomplish their missions, are rarely professional soldiers who think and act like military personnel. They're ordinary people who can blend seamlessly into civilian populations, who possess specialized knowledge that's genuinely useful, and who have the moral courage to use that knowledge when it matters most, regardless of the personal risk involved. The training began the very next day, far earlier than Thomas had expected or felt remotely ready for. He was taken by car on a long, uncomfortable journey to a remote facility hidden deep in the Scottish Highlands, an isolated Victorian estate called Arisaig, surrounded by steep hills covered in winter heather, thick, dark forests of pine and fir, and endless miles of desolate moorland, where the SOE secretly prepared its agents for the brutal realities of life behind enemy lines in occupied Europe. The estate had once belonged to a wealthy industrialist, but had been requisitioned by the government for the duration of the war, transformed from a gentleman's country retreat into a factory for producing spies and saboteurs. For 2 intensive, exhausting weeks that somehow felt both interminably long and frighteningly too short, Thomas learned skills he'd never imagined ordinary civilians might need. The instructors were a mix of former commandos, professional criminals recruited for their specialized knowledge, foreign resistance fighters who'd escaped occupied countries, and intelligence officers with years of experience operating in hostile territory. They were universally hard, uncompromising, and absolutely committed to ensuring their students had the best possible chance of survival. The physical training was brutally demanding for someone who'd spent years working at a desk. Thomas learned how to move silently through complete darkness without making any sound that might alert guards or patrol dogs, how to control his breathing to minimize noise, how to use natural cover effectively. They practiced night navigation across the moorland in all weather conditions, learning to read terrain by touch and memory, since flashlights were obviously forbidden. He learned how to climb walls and fences silently, how to cross open ground without being seen, how to remain motionless for hours despite cold and discomfort. The lock-picking instruction was conducted by a cheerful Londoner named Eddie, who'd been a professional burglar before the war and still spoke enthusiastically about his craft as if teaching legitimate students. He showed Thomas how to feel the mechanisms inside a lock, how to use improvised tools fashioned from whatever materials might be available, how to work quickly under pressure when discovery meant immediate death. Thomas discovered he had surprisingly nimble fingers and good tactile sensitivity from years of precise mechanical work, skills that transferred well to manipulating lock tumblers in darkness. Perhaps most disturbing was the close combat training conducted by a soft-spoken Scotsman named Fairbairn, who'd spent decades in the Shanghai Municipal Police dealing with some of the most violent criminals in the world. He taught Thomas how to kill a man quickly and quietly with his bare hands if circumstances left absolutely no other option, demonstrating techniques on dummies with a clinical precision that was somehow more frightening than if he'd shown emotion. But Fairbairn emphasized repeatedly that successful operatives avoided violence whenever humanly possible, because bodies attracted attention, generated investigations, and brought resources that would otherwise be deployed elsewhere to hunt specifically for you. The language training was intensive and practical. A French instructor named Madame Rousseau, who'd fled Paris just ahead of the German occupation, worked with Thomas for hours each day on conversational French. Not the formal, grammatically perfect French taught in schools, but the casual, colloquial French spoken by merchants and workers in provincial cities. She taught him regional idioms from Toulouse, the city his cover identity supposedly originated from, coaching him on pronunciation until his accent might pass for someone from the south whose dialect differed slightly from Parisian French, but not so much as to arouse suspicion. They practiced endless scenarios, being stopped at a checkpoint and questioned by German soldiers, explaining his presence in a town to suspicious local police, negotiating black market purchases without revealing he was British, responding naturally to the countless small interactions of daily life that could expose an agent who wasn't perfectly prepared. Madame Rousseau was merciless in her criticism, making him repeat phrases dozens of times until they sounded natural rather than rehearsed, until he could produce them instantly under stress, without hesitating to recall vocabulary or construct grammar. Thomas learned how to forge identity documents, carefully copying the typefaces and stamps used by Vichy French authorities, how to age papers so they didn't look suspiciously fresh, how to create a convincing personal history with enough specific details to survive questioning, but not so elaborate that he might contradict himself under interrogation. His cover identity as Jean-Paul Mercier was built methodically, layer by layer, until it felt almost real even to him. The radio operation training was critical. Thomas learned Morse code until he could send and receive at the speeds necessary for brief transmissions that minimized the risk of German direction-finding equipment locating his position. He learned proper radio procedure, how to encode messages using one-time pads, how to operate the suitcase radio sets that agents carried in occupied territory, how to quickly disassemble and conceal the equipment if danger approached. The instructors emphasized that radio operators had one of the highest casualty rates among all types of agents because the Germans had become extremely proficient at detecting and locating unauthorized transmissions. He learned surveillance detection and evasion, how to recognize when he was being followed by plainclothes security agents, how to use reflection in shop windows to observe people behind him, how to shake pursuit through crowded areas by using sudden turns and changes of direction. An instructor named Collins, who'd worked in counter-espionage before the war, taught him to trust his instincts, to pay attention to the small signs that something wasn't right, to understand that in occupied territory, paranoia wasn't a weakness, but a survival skill. There were countless other small skills and pieces of knowledge, things that individually seemed almost trivial, but together formed the complete toolkit an agent needed. How to hide messages in innocuous-seeming locations. How to make and break contact with other resistance members safely. How to arrange safe houses and dead drops. How to recognize the different German military and security organizations and understand their respective areas of authority. How to behave naturally while carrying false documents or contraband. 100 small details that could mean the difference between completing a mission successfully or dying in a Gestapo torture chamber. The other trainees were a remarkably diverse group that surprised Thomas with their ordinariness. A school teacher from Manchester who spoke fluent German and could pass for a Berliner. A dock worker from Liverpool whose knowledge of ships and cargo handling would help coordinate supply operations. A former actress from London's West End whose ability to adopt different personas made her perfect for infiltration work. All of them had specialized skills the SOE desperately needed. All of them were volunteers who understood the risks, and all of them knew with grim certainty that many agents never returned from their missions, disappeared into the vast darkness of occupied Europe, never to be seen again. At night, lying awake in his narrow bed in the cold dormitory, listening to the wind howling across the moors like the voices of ghosts, Thomas thought about his life before the war, when the world had seemed stable and predictable and full of possibility. He'd been engaged once to a wonderful woman named Elizabeth who'd worked as a nurse at St. Thomas's Hospital. They'd been planning a spring wedding, looking at flats they might afford together, imagining the children they might have someday. But she'd died in the Blitz when a German bomb scored a direct hit on the hospital, killing her and 43 others instantly, before Thomas even knew the raid was happening. He had no other close family remaining. His parents were gone, claimed by illness before the war began. His only brother had been killed at Dunkirk during the desperate evacuation, one of thousands who died buying time for others to escape. Perhaps that's why saying yes to the SOE had felt almost inevitable, as if he'd been moving toward this decision for years without realizing it. What did he really have to lose that hadn't already been taken from him? On December 15th, exactly 2 weeks after his initial meeting with Major Henderson that had started everything, Thomas returned to Farnborough for one final visit before disappearing into whatever fate awaited him. The parachute project was progressing remarkably well. Full-scale tests with actual aircraft had been overwhelmingly successful, and production was officially scheduled to begin in January, with the first operational units receiving the new equipment by February. His string trick would save lives, probably hundreds of them before the war ended. That knowledge provided some comfort, made what he was about to do feel worthwhile, even if he never returned to see the results. Peter Blackwood found him in the workshop late in the afternoon, standing alone in front of the prototype they'd built together during those frantic 48 hours that felt like a lifetime ago. "You're really leaving, aren't you? Not just for a few weeks. Really leaving?" Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak for a moment. "I can't tell you where or exactly why. Security protocols forbid it. But yes, I'm leaving. And I honestly don't know if I'll be coming back." "Will you at least be safe? Can you tell me that much?" "I can't even tell you that, Peter. I wish I could. I wish I could explain everything." Peter clasped his shoulder firmly, his grip tight with emotion he was trying to control. "Then I'll keep your desk clear and waiting until you return. However long it takes, Tommy, and whatever you're doing, wherever they're sending you, please be as careful as possible." That night, Thomas packed a small canvas bag with civilian clothes and a few carefully chosen personal items. He included his engineering notebook despite explicit instructions to leave it behind, unable to part with pages that contained not just technical drawings but also sketches of Elizabeth, notes from happier times, small reminders of the person he'd been before the war changed everything. The notebook felt like the last tangible connection to a life that was ending, replaced by something unknown and dangerous. The next morning, December 16th, a nondescript black car arrived to collect him before dawn. The driver was a young woman in SOE uniform who said absolutely nothing during the 3-hour journey to a small airfield hidden somewhere near the southern coast. Thomas watched the English countryside passing by his window, the bare winter trees skeletal against the grey sky, the ancient stone walls dividing frozen fields, the small villages that seemed frozen in time, unchanged for centuries until the war had crashed into them like a tidal wave. He tried to memorize it all, storing away images in case he never saw England again. At the airfield, Colonel Davies was waiting beside a black-painted Lysander aircraft, one of the specialized planes used for clandestine insertions into occupied territory. Standing with him was Victor, the Czech engineer Thomas had met briefly before, who would apparently be coordinating his mission from Britain. "Last chance to change your mind and walk away," Davies said, without any preamble or ceremony. "No shame in it. This isn't for everyone." Only Thomas thought of the pilots who died because parachutes failed. He thought of Elizabeth, buried somewhere in a mass grave in London. He thought of Peter's son flying missions over Germany every night. He thought of all the suffering the Nazis had caused and would continue to cause until someone stopped them. He shook his head firmly. "I'm ready as I'll ever be." Davies handed him a thick envelope. "Your identity papers and documentation. You're now Jean-Paul Mercier, a fabric merchant from Toulouse, traveling to Lyon on business. Everything you need to know about your cover identity is in this package. Memorize every detail completely and then destroy all the documents before you land in France. If you're caught with British materials, there's nothing anyone can do to save you." Victor stepped forward, his expression grave. "The resistance cell is expecting someone, though they don't know exactly when you'll arrive or precisely what you look like. The recognition code phrase is, 'The string holds what the knot cannot.' They should respond with, 'but only if the tension is true.' Don't trust anyone, absolutely anyone, who doesn't know this exchange perfectly. Collaborators are everywhere, and the Gestapo has infiltrated several resistance groups." Thomas climbed awkwardly into the cramped rear compartment of the Lysander, his heart pounding so hard he worried it might be audible over the aircraft's engine. The pilot, an RAF officer who looked barely old enough to shave, twisted around to give him a cheerful thumbs up that seemed wildly inappropriate given the circumstances. The engine roared to life with a deafening noise, and the plane began to taxi down the rough grass runway, bouncing over frozen ruts. As they lifted off into the grey December sky, Thomas looked down at England, receding steadily below him, the patchwork of fields and villages and roads gradually disappearing into distance and mist. He wondered with a strange, detached curiosity if he would ever see his homeland again, or if he was watching it vanish forever, a final glimpse of everything familiar before plunging into the absolute unknown. The flight took several tense hours, the pilot flying dangerously low to avoid German radar, following the coastline before cutting inland over occupied France. Thomas memorized his false identity from the documents, forcing himself to think in character, to become Jean-Paul Mercier in his mind. When he'd committed everything to memory, he methodically tore the papers into tiny pieces and scattered them from the aircraft, watching them disperse into the slipstream like confetti at a wedding, a macabre comparison that made him smile grimly. They landed in a remote field somewhere in central France, well after midnight, the exact location unknown to Thomas and irrelevant to his mission. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, making the darkness nearly absolute. As soon as the plane's wheels touched the frozen ground, figures emerged rapidly from the tree line at the field's edge, dark shapes moving quickly, voices calling out passwords in urgent French. Thomas climbed stiffly out of the aircraft, his legs unsteady after hours of cramped immobility. A man approached quickly from the darkness, middle-aged with a deeply lined face, wearing a worker's cap and threadbare jacket despite the bitter cold. He spoke rapidly in French, too quickly for Thomas's limited language skills to fully follow, but he caught the recognition code phrase clearly. "The string holds what the knot cannot." Thomas responded carefully, hoping his pronunciation was adequate. "But only if the tension is true." The man's tense face broke into a relieved smile, and he gripped Thomas's arm firmly. "Welcome to France, monsieur. I am Marcel. We must move very quickly now. The Germans patrol this entire area heavily, and if they heard the aircraft, we have perhaps 20 minutes before they arrive to investigate." They hurried across the frozen field toward a truck hidden in the shadows of the trees. Thomas stumbling occasionally on the uneven ground, his city-bred feet unaccustomed to navigating fields in darkness. Behind them, the Lysander was already turning, the pilot wasting no time preparing to leave. Within 2 minutes, the plane had disappeared back into the night sky, its engine noise fading rapidly, and Thomas was completely alone in occupied France with people he'd never met before and had no reason to trust beyond a simple code phrase. The truck drove for over 2 hours on dark country roads, avoiding populated areas, skirting towns where German checkpoints might be stationed. Marcel explained in his broken but understandable English that they were heading to a safe house in the countryside outside Lyon, where Thomas would meet the other members of the resistance cell he'd be working with. "Your skill with the strings and tension systems, it is very valuable to us," Marcel said, as they bounced along rutted roads. "We have several operations planned that require precise timing, precise mechanical solutions. The Germans, they have made the bridges and the railway lines very difficult to sabotage with conventional methods. Too many guards, too much surveillance. But with your knowledge, perhaps we can find new approaches that will succeed where traditional methods have failed." They finally arrived at an isolated farmhouse just as dawn was beginning to break, painting the eastern sky in shades of grey and pale orange. The building was old and weathered, surrounded by empty fields and bare winter woods, with no other structures visible in any direction. Inside, 3 other people were waiting anxiously, warming themselves by a small fire that provided more psychological comfort than actual heat. A woman named Isabel, perhaps 40 years old, who Thomas learned had been a school teacher before the occupation, now dedicated to resistance work after her husband was taken by the Gestapo for the crime of listening to BBC broadcasts. A very young man named Antoine, certainly no older than 18, despite the hardness in his eyes, whose entire family had been shot by German soldiers for the crime of hiding Jewish refugees in their barn. And an elderly gentleman, white-haired and scholarly-looking, who introduced himself with old-world formality as Professor Dubois, formerly of the University of Lyon's physics department, now technically retired, but actually very actively involved in sabotage planning. Over the next several days, working with an intensity born of urgency and the knowledge that every hour of delay could mean more lives lost, Thomas worked extensively and intensively with the resistance cell members to adapt his innovative tension principles to their most critical and urgent sabotage requirements. They desperately needed to destroy a strategically vital railway bridge located approximately 30 kilometers east of Lyon, that carried heavily loaded German supply trains eastward several times each day to support Wehrmacht divisions fighting increasingly desperate and brutal campaigns in Russia and along the Eastern Front. The bridge itself was a substantial, well-engineered iron and steel structure built during the late 19th century industrial expansion, spanning a deep gorge with a fast-flowing river churning far below, through rapids that made any approach from the water impossible, originally designed by renowned French engineers to carry the heaviest freight loads imaginable at the time, but also, by virtue of its very engineering excellence and robust construction, remarkably difficult to damage. Significantly, without truly enormous quantities of explosives that would be impossible to transport and place covertly. Previous resistance attempts to destroy or even seriously damage this critical bridge using conventional explosives and traditional sabotage methods had failed catastrophically and tragically, sometimes with terrible costs in captured operatives who'd been subjected to brutal interrogation, torture, and eventual execution by the Gestapo. The bridge was far too heavily guarded and constantly monitored to permit any conventional approach, even under the cover of complete darkness on moonless nights. German military engineers, having learned painful lessons from earlier successful sabotage operations elsewhere throughout occupied France, had methodically installed powerful searchlights at strategic points that swept the entire massive structure continuously every few minutes throughout the night, never allowing any extended periods of darkness. Fortified guard posts were positioned at both ends of the bridge, with heavy machine gun emplacements commanding absolutely perfect fields of fire across any possible approach route, making direct assault suicidal. Regular patrols, consisting of Wehrmacht soldiers accompanied by specially trained guard dogs, walked the entire length of the bridge structure at deliberately irregular intervals, specifically designed and scheduled to catch saboteurs, who might attempt to time their approach to avoid detection during supposed gaps in coverage. Additionally, the Germans had installed sophisticated tripwires and alarm systems at multiple strategic points along potential infiltration routes. Backed up by quick response units stationed within minutes of the bridge location who could respond immediately to any alarm or suspicious activity. Any explosive charge remotely large enough to guarantee complete structural destruction of such a massively built bridge would be immediately spotted and neutralized by these comprehensive, overlapping security measures long before it could be properly positioned, armed, and detonated successfully. The resistance had lost 4 good operatives in previous attempts, brave men and women who'd been caught, tortured for information about their networks, and publicly executed as warnings to others who might consider resistance activities. But Thomas's innovative string trick approach, refined through intense collaboration with the brilliant Professor Dubois, offered a completely revolutionary methodology that circumvented most of these seemingly insurmountable security obstacles through elegant engineering rather than brute force. By using multiple carefully designed and precisely calibrated tension systems working in perfect coordination, combined with ingeniously delayed mechanical fuses that required absolutely no electrical components that might corrode or fail in the perpetually damp conditions near the river, they could theoretically place numerous smaller explosive charges at precisely calculated structural weak points that detailed engineering analysis had revealed as critical load-bearing nodes, charges. Sufficiently small to be concealed effectively during brief daytime access periods, when civilian workers sometimes passed nearby or maintenance crews performed routine inspections. These multiple charges would be timed through Thomas's tension-based synchronization system to detonate simultaneously with millisecond precision when a heavily loaded military supply train was crossing the bridge at operational speed. The combined tremendous weight of the fully loaded train itself, carefully calculated from extensive intelligence reports about typical cargo manifests and Wehrmacht logistics, combined strategically with the precisely placed explosives, destroying multiple key structural members at mathematically determined optimal points, would initiate a cascading progressive structural failure that would be physically impossible to prevent or arrest once the failure sequence began, regardless of how quickly German engineers might attempt to respond. Thomas spent exhaustingly long hours, often working late into the night by candlelight that made his eyes ache, collaborating intensively shoulder to shoulder with Professor Dubois, The elderly but still remarkably sharp physicist, whose deep theoretical knowledge of structural mechanics, material properties, stress analysis, and failure modes complemented Thomas's practical engineering expertise absolutely perfectly. The two of them would bend over carefully copied and smuggled structural plans of the bridge that had been obtained at tremendous personal risk by brave resistance members working as clerks in the regional railway administrative offices, plans showing in meticulous detail every single beam, every rivet placement, every connection point, every structural member of the massive bridge. They performed extraordinarily complex calculations by hand, without the benefit of mechanical calculators that might have made the work faster, to identify exact load-bearing stress concentration points, painstakingly analyzing in exhaustive detail exactly how forces would distribute and propagate through the interconnected structural system when a moving train applied severe dynamic loading at various speeds and weights, determining with mathematical precision exactly where relatively small, explosive charges, perhaps a quarter or less of the size conventionally considered necessary, could cause absolutely maximum catastrophic damage by strategically removing specific critical structural elements at the exact calculated moment when alternative load paths were already stressed beyond their ultimate safety margins, and therefore incapable of compensating for the sudden loss of primary support members. Meanwhile, Isabel deployed her extensive and carefully cultivated black market contacts, relationships built up painfully and dangerously over many months of patient networking, whispered conversations in shadowy cafes, and careful vetting to avoid Gestapo infiltrators, to obtain the highly specialized materials they desperately needed for the complex operation. Explosives themselves were surprisingly and disturbingly available if you knew exactly whom to ask, and had valuable items to trade as currency, since numerous German soldiers at all levels of the military hierarchy routinely supplemented their inadequate official pay by selling stolen military supplies to the black market, taking advantage of the chaos and incomplete record-keeping that characterized Wehrmacht logistics in occupied territories. The real challenges, the truly difficult procurement problems that tested Isabel's resourcefulness and connections to their absolute limits, involved obtaining the very specific types of heavy cordage with exactly the right combination of tensile strength characteristics and controlled elasticity properties that Thomas required for his sophisticated tension mechanisms, finding precision timing mechanisms of appropriate types that had to work with absolute flawless reliability despite persistent cold and moisture exposure typical of the riverside location, and securing specialized detonators that would fire reliably under any conditions, but were small enough and sufficiently simple in appearance to conceal effectively if they were discovered during a casual search that didn't involve detailed technical examination. Each critically needed item required separate and distinct negotiations with different suppliers, many of whom naturally distrusted each other and refused to work together. Careful verification through multiple independent sources that they weren't inadvertently dealing with Gestapo informants or German intelligence agents, provocateurs who'd infiltrated the black market specifically to identify resistance members, and nerve-wracking transactions that could lead directly to immediate arrest, brutal interrogation, and swift execution if anything went wrong or if any participant proved to be working for the Germans. Isabel conducted these dangerous negotiations with remarkable courage and skill, always meeting potential suppliers in public places where she could observe for surveillance, always having escape routes planned and memorized, always ready to abandon a deal if anything seemed even slightly suspicious or wrong. Young Antoine, despite his extreme youth and the terrible psychological trauma he'd already experienced watching his entire family murdered, conducted incredibly dangerous and remarkably professional reconnaissance missions to the bridge itself. traveling there repeatedly by bicycle along routes that avoided German checkpoints, spending long, exhausting hours concealed in carefully selected hiding positions in the surrounding dense forests and hillsides, meticulously noting every single detail of guard patterns, patrol procedures, searchlight coverage, and security protocols. He timed precisely how long it took individual patrols to walk the bridge's considerable length, carefully measured the exact intervals between searchlight sweeps and identified brief gaps in coverage, photographed particularly vulnerable structural access points using a small camera that could certainly get him summarily shot if German soldiers discovered it during a random search, documented the shift changes for guards and the procedures they followed during transitions, and gradually built up an extraordinarily comprehensive and detailed picture of security measures and their exploitable weaknesses. Antoine's youth actually worked significantly in his favor because German soldiers often reflexively dismissed teenagers as harmless children incapable of serious resistance activities. But his lack of experience in clandestine operations also meant he had no accumulated knowledge or instincts to guide his decisions, forcing him to rely entirely on raw courage, careful observation skills, and meticulous attention to detail he'd somehow maintained despite the devastating trauma of his family's murder. On December 20th, 4 days after Thomas had parachuted into occupied France, everything was finally ready. The plan was to set the charges late that night and detonate them the following morning when intelligence from their network indicated a particularly important supply train would be crossing, carrying ammunition and winter equipment desperately needed by German forces in the east. But that afternoon, disaster struck without warning. Antoine returned from Lyon with devastating news. The Gestapo had raided a safe house on the opposite side of the city, arresting several resistance members. There were terrible rumors that someone had been turned, was providing information to the Germans, possibly under torture or possibly for money. "We need to abort the mission immediately," Isabel said urgently, her face pale with fear. "If they know about us, if they're coming here to arrest us, we'll be walking into a trap." De Marcel shook his head stubbornly. "That train carries ammunition and equipment for the Wehrmacht divisions fighting in Russia. If we can destroy it, we potentially save Russian lives. We slow their offensive operations. The mission must proceed as planned." Thomas felt the enormous weight of the decision pressing down on them all. His engineering principles were about to be used not to save lives, but to deliberately take them, to kill German soldiers who might be conscripts, might have families waiting for them, might hate the war as much as anyone. But these were also soldiers fighting for a regime that had brought unspeakable evil to the world, that was systematically murdering millions. There was no moral clarity here, no simple right and wrong, only the grinding necessity of war and the hope that by shortening it, fewer people would die overall. That night, moving through bitter December cold that made their fingers clumsy and their breath visible, they approached the bridge. Thomas and Marcel worked beneath the massive structure, placing charges with hands that shook from cold and fear, while Antoine kept watch from a concealed position and Isabel monitored German radio traffic on a stolen receiver, listening for any indication they'd been detected. The tension system worked exactly as Thomas had designed it. The strings he'd rigged created an interconnected web of detonators, each one precisely calibrated to trigger at the exact moment of maximum stress when the train's enormous weight would be centered on the bridge's weakest structural points. They finished their work just before dawn and retreated to the farmhouse to wait. All they could do now was hope the intelligence was accurate, hope the train would come, hope the Germans hadn't somehow discovered the charges. At 9:37 the next morning, December 21st, 1943, the train began crossing the bridge right on schedule. From 3 kilometers away, Thomas heard the massive explosion, a deep bass rumble that seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. A column of black smoke rose into the winter sky, visible for miles. Marcel received confirmation within an hour through their clandestine communication network. The bridge had collapsed completely, taking the train with it into the river far below. There were significant German casualties, but the mission had succeeded beyond their highest expectations. The supply line was severed, and it would take the Germans weeks or months to repair the damage. That night, they celebrated quietly at the farmhouse, sharing a precious bottle of wine that Professor Dubois had been saving for years for exactly such an occasion. Thomas felt numb and disconnected, struggling to process the reality that his engineering knowledge, his simple string trick, had just been used to kill dozens of human beings. The moral weight of it threatened to crush him. Isabel found him sitting alone in the dark kitchen late that night. "You did a necessary thing today," she said gently, sitting beside him. "A good thing, despite how it feels." "Did I? Men died because of calculations I made, because of systems I designed. The men who would have used those supplies to kill many more innocent people. This is war, monsieur. There are no clean hands, no perfect choices, only necessary actions that we hope will bring a better world closer." The next morning, December 22nd, Marcel woke Thomas before dawn, his face grim. "You need to leave immediately. The Gestapo is conducting intensive sweeps of the entire area, searching for whoever destroyed the bridge. It's not safe for you to remain here any longer. They're checking papers, arresting anyone suspicious. Where can I go?" "Back to England if possible. We've requested an emergency extraction, but it will take time to arrange. Until then, you need to hide. We have an abandoned barn about 2 kilometers from here, where you should be safe for a day or two until we can get you out of France." They gave him a bicycle and careful directions to the hiding place. Thomas left the farmhouse just as weak winter sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds, pedaling through frozen countryside, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, jumping at every sound. The barn was exactly where Marcel had indicated, a dilapidated structure at the edge of a dark forest, half its roof missing, its walls leaning at precarious angles. Thomas hid the bicycle in the undergrowth and climbed carefully into the hayloft, wrapping himself in old, musty blankets he found there. He had enough food for perhaps 1 full day and a loaded pistol with 6 bullets, given to him by Marcel with the grim instruction that if capture seemed inevitable, he should save the last bullet for himself rather than face Gestapo interrogation. He waited through that entire day, December 22nd, and into the night, listening intently to every sound, his nerves stretched to breaking point, jumping violently at every creak of old wood settling, every rustle of small animals in the straw. But no one came. The hours dragged past with agonizing slowness. The next day, December 23rd, passed in similar terrible tension. Thomas ate the last of his meager food supply at noon, chewing slowly to make it last, and tried unsuccessfully to sleep, knowing he needed to be alert for the extraction attempt that night. At dusk, just as darkness was beginning to fall, he heard voices outside the barn, German voices speaking in their harsh, clipped language. His heart felt like it might explode from his chest as he heard heavy footsteps, the creak of the barn door being forced open. Soldiers were methodically searching the building, and there was nowhere for him to run. Thomas pressed himself desperately into the deepest shadows of the loft, the pistol gripped in his sweating hand, barely daring to breathe. He could hear them directly below him now, speaking casually to each other as they poked through the debris on the ground floor, completely unaware that their quarry was hiding just meters above their heads. One soldier called out to the others, and there was a brief discussion that Thomas couldn't follow. Then, incredibly, they were leaving, moving on to search the next location on their list. Thomas remained frozen in place for what felt like hours after the sounds faded, not daring to move a muscle until he was absolutely certain they were gone. At midnight on December 23rd, he carefully left the barn, and made his way through the dark forest to the extraction point they'd arranged. A small clearing marked by 3 distinctive oak trees. The night was crystal clear and bitterly cold, stars blazing overhead in numbers impossible to see in light-polluted England, their beauty seeming to mock his desperate situation. He waited in the concealing shadows at the clearing's edge, watching for the aircraft that would supposedly take him home to safety. He waited past the agreed-upon time, past any reasonable delay for weather or operational complications. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Thomas was forced to accept the terrible truth. Something had gone catastrophically wrong. The pickup had been compromised, or weather had prevented the flight, or his contacts had been arrested, or any of a dozen other possibilities. Whatever the reason, he was stranded in occupied France with no support, no extraction plan, and German forces actively searching for him. With no other options presenting themselves, he began walking back toward the barn, planning to hide there for another day, while trying desperately to figure out what to do next. But as he approached through the early morning mist, he saw German military vehicles parked near the structure, soldiers systematically moving through the area in an obviously well-organized search pattern designed to catch anyone trying to hide. Thomas turned and ran blindly into the forest, branches tearing at his face and clothes, his breath coming in ragged gasps, driven by pure animal instinct to escape. He ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out completely. He finally collapsed in a steep ravine, concealed beneath overhanging rocks and thick undergrowth, and there he remained hidden through the entire day of December 24th, Christmas Eve, listening to the distant sounds of the search gradually fading as the Germans expanded their cordon elsewhere. On Christmas Day, 1943, Thomas Garrett emerged from his hiding place, cold, hungry, filthy, and more alone than he'd ever been in his entire life. He was lost somewhere in occupied France, with no way to contact the resistance or any means of reaching England. All he possessed were his stolen clothes, his forged identity papers that might not withstand serious scrutiny, the useless pistol with its 6 bullets, and the engineering knowledge that had brought him to this desperate situation. He made a difficult decision. He would abandon any attempt to contact the resistance or wait for extraction that might never come. Instead, he would head south on his own, trying to reach the Swiss border and escape occupied territory entirely through neutral Switzerland. It would require weeks of dangerous travel through winter conditions, sleeping wherever he could find shelter, stealing food when possible, always staying ahead of the Germans who would shoot him on sight if they discovered his true identity. The last confirmed sighting of Thomas Garrett was on December 27th in a tiny village near the Swiss border, whose name has been lost to history. He appeared at a bakery just after dawn, trading his watch for bread and asking directions in halting French. The elderly baker who served him later told resistance members that an exhausted English engineer had passed through, that he'd seemed determined but physically near the end of his endurance, that his eyes held a haunted look she'd seen in too many refugees. After that single encounter, Thomas Garrett vanished completely and permanently, without any trace. He simply disappeared into the vast chaos of occupied Europe as if he'd never existed. Back in England, Major Henderson received the devastating official notification in early January that Thomas had failed to make his scheduled extraction. The SOE launched extensive inquiries through all their networks operating in France, but no useful information emerged. Thomas Garrett had simply disappeared, swallowed by the war that consumed so many lives without leaving any evidence or explanation. His string-trick parachute mechanism, however, lived on and flourished. The innovation went into full production exactly as planned in January 1944, and over the following 18 months before the war in Europe ended, it saved an estimated 370 lives. pilots and crew members who would certainly have died in ejections, but who survived because Thomas's simple, elegant solution worked flawlessly every single time it was used. Peter Blackwood kept Thomas's desk meticulously clear at Farnborough, exactly as he'd promised, maintaining it as a kind of shrine. He kept it clear through D-Day and the liberation of France, through VE Day celebrations when the war in Europe finally ended, through the gradual demobilization as Britain tried to return to peacetime normality. He kept it clear for 5 years after Thomas disappeared, always hoping his friend would somehow walk through the door with an improbable story of survival and explain where he'd been. But Thomas Garrett never returned home. His official status was eventually changed from missing to presumed killed in action, December 1943. His name was added to the memorial wall at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, one among hundreds of names honoring those who had given everything in service to their country. Decades after the war ended, researchers investigating SOE operations during the occupation found scattered references in fragmentary documents to an engineer who'd been inserted into France to assist resistance operations. But the files were incomplete, many having been deliberately destroyed or simply lost in the chaos of post-war record-keeping. The full details of Thomas's mission, his work with the Lion Resistance Cell, and his contribution to the bridge destruction were never fully documented or officially acknowledged. Various theories emerged over the years about what might have happened to Thomas Garrett after he disappeared. Some researchers believed he was captured by the Gestapo during their sweep of the area and executed, his death simply never recorded in the confused final years of the occupation. Others theorized that he died attempting to cross the Swiss border, perhaps caught in an avalanche in the treacherous mountain passes, or succumbing to exposure in the brutal winter conditions of 1943-44. A few persistent optimists suggested he might have survived somehow, assumed a new identity, and started a completely new life somewhere in Europe after the war ended, perhaps with no memory of his past, or perhaps simply choosing to remain disappeared for reasons no one could understand. The truth is that nobody knows with any certainty what happened to Thomas Garrett after that December morning in 1943. The man who came up with the elegantly simple string trick, who saved hundreds of lives with an innovation born from playing with ordinary cotton string in his freezing London kitchen, who volunteered for a dangerous mission because he felt he had nothing left to lose, vanished completely into history, leaving behind only his remarkable contribution to aviation safety, a few fragmentary documents, and the enduring mystery of his fate. What remains beyond doubt is the legacy of his work. The fundamental tension distribution principle he developed influenced not just parachute deployment mechanisms, but numerous other applications in the decades that followed. Engineering students around the world still study his original notebooks, carefully preserved in the archives at Farnborough, marveling at the elegant simplicity of solutions that came from careful observation of natural systems. His approach to engineering, finding inspiration in biological systems and trusting that simple solutions were often superior to complex ones, influenced generations of designers and inventors. And sometimes, on quiet winter evenings at the King's Arms pub near Farnborough, elderly engineers who knew Thomas personally, or who simply know his story through institutional memory, will raise a glass of whiskey in tribute to the memory of the quiet, unassuming man who saw something profoundly important in an ordinary piece of string, who risked absolutely everything to help win a war against evil, who saved hundreds of lives through pure ingenuity, and who disappeared without a trace just days after achieving his greatest triumph, leaving behind only unanswered questions, a brilliant innovation that outlived him by generations, and the enduring mystery of what really happened on that December morning in occupied France, when Thomas Garrett walked into history and never emerged again.